Dr. Paul, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. I very much enjoyed your presentation, and I was looking forward to having this discussion with you about your book, The Cold War's Killing Fields, Rethinking the Long Peace. Your book boldly argues that the Cold War, long viewed as mostly peaceful, if tense, diplomatic standoff between democracy and communism, was actually a part of a vast, deadly conflict that killed millions on battlegrounds across the post-colonial world. What informs the substance of this argument?
So when I started writing the book, what I really wanted to do was lay out a sort of geography of the Cold War that tracked where mass violence occurred during the decades between 1945 and approximately 1990. I thought that this was critical in gaining a better understanding of the dynamics of international politics that connected the Cold War to the emergence of the post-colonial world. So on the one hand, I was trying to push back against the notion that the Cold War was primarily characterized by the diplomatic tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and write a more inclusive history that would bring in other parts of the world that experienced large-scale violence. But beyond simply tracking the incidents of these major wars during the Cold War, I wanted to figure out what sort of geographical and chronological patterns existed. Why was it that large-scale violence occurred in East Asia in the 1940s, 1950s, and then became somewhat more peaceful. But then by the time you get to the 1960s, there's another wave of mass violence and warfare and conflict in South and Southeast Asia. I wanted to know why that was. And then finally, in the last decade or so of the Cold War, you see the Middle East and Central Asia emerging as the most war-torn region of the world. So it struck me that this was not really a random process. Violence seemed to cluster in certain areas, certain regions during certain times. And eventually what I concluded was that a lot of this had to do with the influence of the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, and the Sino-Soviet split, and then also the Iranian Revolution. And that by reorienting this viewpoint away from the Cold War as an East-West phenomenon that took place between Washington and Moscow, you're able to gain an understanding of the international politics of the Cold War that gives a great deal more agency to peoples and states in the post-colonial world. And so for my purposes, I thought this was a much more focused, much more structured approach to a global Cold War.
So how do you define what you call the Cold War's killing field?
Right. So in keeping with this effort to really lay down a geography and a periodization of large-scale violence during the Cold War, what I did is I ended up mapping out a lot of this, and I found that there was a specific part of the world that saw most of the something like 70% of mass violence occur in this part of the world. This is what I call the Cold War's killing fields. These are typically, for the most part, they're post-colonial territories. They lay along the borders of either the Soviet Union or Communist China, and they're places that witness significant intervention from one or both superpowers, but they're also areas that are going through the turmoil and the conflict associated with post-colonial nation building and various struggles for power in the post-colonial world.
What linkages do you see between the rise of nationalism and the decolonization movement in the Third World or the Global South and the politics of the Cold War?
So these are two, I argue that these are two initially they're fairly distinct processes, but they become entangled very quickly in the 1940s as you find a situation where the former European colonial powers are no longer in a position to really exercise as much authority over colonial territories. The structure of European colonialism is falling apart. The structure of the Japanese empire is collapsing. And this creates a sort of power vacuum. And the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, are both primarily, in the early stages, they're focused on Europe. But it's really the Chinese Revolution that convinces key leaders in the United States and the Soviet Union that the stakes in a lot of these post-colonial territories are high enough that this is a part of the world that they need to be paying attention to. And it's that, it's the victory of Mao and the Chinese communists that really ends up pulling the influence of the superpower into these other parts of the world that aren't initially high on their list of priorities as the post-45 era begins. And so it really is, in the way that I structure the book, it really is a sort of dynamic where various revolutionary movements in the post-colonial world end up pulling the superpowers onto these battlefields in different ways. Right? The most explicit ways are, of course, in the form of direct military interventions, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Soviet War in Afghanistan. But much more prevalent than these direct interventions are more subtle instances, right? There are instances of CIA and KGB coups. There are extensive records of superpower aid to a lot of these states that are these states and revolutionary movements that are fighting in these territories. And so what ends up happening is that the superpowers, who are primarily interested in dynamics of the Cold War, end up funding and supporting and fueling conflicts that already exist in parts of the post-colonial world. So you have various post-colonial factions, states, movements that are vying for power in many of these territories. And because these territories are located in what we can think of as the borders along the edge of the communist world, it's a contested zone. And so the superpowers are very frequently in a position where they feel like they have to direct
the flow of events.
Yeah, well, the flow of weapons, the flow of cash, and sometimes the flow of soldiers.
Wonderful. Right. Like I said in the beginning, I very much enjoyed your presentation this morning, and I would really want you to just briefly identify the major themes that are critical for pedagogy, or if I can say, that are critical for teaching and learning the global aspects of the Cold War.
So one of the key things that I try to do, as we just spoke about, is draw out a connection between the dynamics of the East-West Cold War and the process of decolonization, and more than just decolonization specifically, the emergence of the post-colonial world, because I think there's often a lot of confusion where people will argue that all of these conflicts come out of decolonization, right? That these are wars of anti-colonial liberation. In many cases, these are conflicts that are actually taking place in post-colonial societies, right? The formal process of decolonization has already taken place in a lot of these regions. And what you really see is a convergence of Cold War dynamics with struggles over the post-colonial nation in many of these territories. So when I teach this, I try to make that clear. I always remind my students that for the vast majority of the world's population, the second half of the 20th century is more notable for the process of decolonization and the emergence of new post-colonial nation states than for the Cold War. Right? That decolonization means more to the majority of the human population than the Cold War does. And this is something that teaching in the United States is often not apparent to a lot of my students. So I always try to drive that home. I always try to emphasize various viewpoints and perspectives of the key participants, right? So while we talk about the decisions that are being made by leaders, say, in Washington, D.C., I also wanted to spend a lot of time talking about the perspective and the goals of various leaders in the post-colonial world, right? So what is driving Chinese leaders? What's driving Korean leaders? What's driving Vietnamese leaders? What's driving social and political movements in Afghanistan and Iran? That sort of thing. Sort of a multiplicity and a diversity of different viewpoints, I think, is critical to telling the history of or to teaching the history of the Cold War as a global phenomenon rather than as something that is primarily Americentric.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good day.